Question 1. The efficiency study reveals that a junior associate in an Alabama law firm is tasked with advising a client on a complex property dispute. The associate discovers a controlling Alabama Supreme Court decision from 1950 that appears to address a similar factual scenario. However, the associate also notes that societal norms and land use practices have significantly evolved since 1950, and the prior ruling, if applied strictly, might lead to an outcome that seems inequitable in the present context. What is the most appropriate course of action for the associate to take in advising the client, considering the principles of stare decisis within the Alabama common law system? Option A. Recommend that the client immediately seek to have the 1950 ruling overturned by filing a novel legal challenge, arguing that it is no longer relevant due to societal changes, without first exploring existing avenues for distinguishing the case. Option B. Thoroughly research subsequent Alabama appellate court decisions to determine if the 1950 ruling has been distinguished, modified, or implicitly overruled by later cases, and analyze whether the current factual circumstances can be factually distinguished from the precedent. Option C. Apply the 1950 ruling as written, but advise the client that the outcome may be perceived as unfair due to the passage of time, without undertaking further legal analysis to explore potential distinctions or subsequent judicial interpretations. Option D. Advise the client that the 1950 Alabama Supreme Court decision is binding and must be applied, regardless of any perceived inequities or changes in societal norms, to ensure consistency in legal outcomes. The correct answer is B. Thoroughly research subsequent Alabama appellate court decisions to determine if the 1950 ruling has been distinguished, modified, or implicitly overruled by later cases, and analyze whether the current factual circumstances can be factually distinguished from the precedent. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a common challenge faced by legal professionals in Alabama, navigating the application of precedent in a rapidly evolving legal landscape. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of stare decisis, balancing the need for consistency and predictability with the imperative to adapt to new factual circumstances and evolving societal norms, all within the framework of Alabama common law. Misinterpreting or misapplying precedent can lead to incorrect legal advice, potentially harming clients and undermining the integrity of the judicial system. The best approach involves a thorough analysis of the controlling precedent from Alabama appellate courts. This means identifying the core legal principles established in prior decisions and carefully examining the facts of the current case to determine if they are sufficiently analogous to those in the precedent-setting cases. If the facts are materially different, or if the precedent is demonstrably outdated or has been implicitly or explicitly modified by subsequent rulings, then it may be appropriate to distinguish the current case from the prior ruling or argue for an exception. This approach upholds the principle of stare decisis by respecting established law, while also acknowledging the dynamic nature of legal interpretation and the need for justice in individual cases. Alabama law, like other common law jurisdictions, relies on this careful application of precedent to ensure stability and fairness. An incorrect approach would be to rigidly apply a prior Alabama ruling without considering whether the facts of the current case are sufficiently similar. This fails to recognize that precedent is not an immutable command but a guide, and that distinguishing cases based on factual differences is a fundamental aspect of common law reasoning. Another incorrect approach would be to disregard controlling Alabama precedent simply because it appears inconvenient or leads to an unfavorable outcome. This directly violates the doctrine of stare decisis and undermines the predictability that is essential for a functioning legal system. Finally, attempting to create entirely new legal principles without grounding them in existing Alabama precedent, or clearly articulating why the existing precedent should be overturned or distinguished, would be an inappropriate overreach, as it bypasses the established hierarchical structure of judicial decision-making in Alabama. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying all relevant Alabama appellate court decisions. It must then critically analyze the holdings and reasoning of these precedents, comparing the material facts of the current case to those in the prior decisions. If the facts are distinguishable, the professional should articulate the specific factual differences that warrant a different outcome. If the precedent appears to be outdated or inconsistent with broader legal trends, the professional should consider whether there are strong arguments for distinguishing the case or, in rare circumstances, for advocating for a change in the law, always within the established procedural mechanisms. Question 2. Quality control measures reveal that an attorney in your firm is preparing to file a civil complaint in Alabama. The defendant resides in Georgia, but occasionally conducts business in Mobile, Alabama. The dispute arises from a contract signed in Birmingham, Alabama, and involves a breach of contract claim. The attorney's initial draft focuses heavily on the convenience of filing in Mobile due to the defendant's business presence there, but has not yet fully articulated the basis for the court's power over the defendant or its authority to hear contract disputes. What is the most appropriate next step to ensure compliance with Alabama's common law system regarding jurisdiction and venue? Option A. Thoroughly analyze and articulate the basis for both subject matter jurisdiction, the court's power to hear contract disputes, and personal jurisdiction over the Georgia resident defendant, based on minimum contacts with Alabama, including their business in Mobile and the contract's connection to Birmingham, before proceeding to determine the most appropriate venue within Alabama. Option B. Advise the client to file the lawsuit in Georgia, as the defendant resides there, without conducting a detailed analysis of Alabama's jurisdictional rules or the potential for establishing jurisdiction in Alabama. Option C. Focus solely on establishing venue in Mobile County, assuming that the defendant's business activities in Alabama will automatically confer personal jurisdiction and that the state court has inherent authority to hear contract disputes. Option D. Immediately file the complaint in Mobile County, Alabama, as the defendant's occasional business presence there satisfies venue requirements, and the court can address jurisdictional issues later if raised by the defendant. Correct answer is A. Thoroughly analyze and articulate the basis for both subject matter jurisdiction, the court's power to hear contract disputes, and personal jurisdiction over the Georgia resident defendant, based on minimum contacts with Alabama, including their business in Mobile and the contract's connection to Birmingham, before proceeding to determine the most appropriate venue within Alabama. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a nuanced understanding of Alabama's jurisdictional rules, specifically the distinction between subject matter jurisdiction and personal jurisdiction, and how venue considerations interact with these fundamental requirements. A misstep in determining the proper court can lead to dismissal, wasted resources, and potential prejudice to the client's case. Careful judgment is required to ensure the chosen forum is not only convenient but legally permissible. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough analysis of both subject matter jurisdiction and personal jurisdiction over the defendant before considering venue. Subject matter jurisdiction determines if the court has the authority to hear the type of case, e.g., state court for most civil matters, federal court for federal questions or diversity. Personal jurisdiction concerns the court's power over the defendant, typically established through the defendant's domicile, consent, or sufficient minimum contacts with Alabama. Once these foundational jurisdictional hurdles are cleared, venue rules, which dictate the proper geographical location within Alabama for the lawsuit, can be applied. This sequential approach ensures that the case is filed in a court that has the fundamental authority to adjudicate the dispute, aligning with Alabama's rules of civil procedure and common law principles governing jurisdiction. Incorrect approach is analysis. Proceeding solely by considering venue without first establishing subject matter and personal jurisdiction is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Venue rules are secondary to jurisdiction. If a court lacks jurisdiction, venue is irrelevant. Focusing only on the convenience of the forum without verifying the court's power over the parties or the subject matter risks filing a lawsuit in a court that cannot legally hear the case, leading to dismissal and potential malpractice claims. Similarly, assuming jurisdiction based on the defendant's presence in Alabama without a detailed minimum contacts analysis or proper service of process is legally unsound and violates professional obligations to ensure proper legal procedure. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a hierarchical decision-making process when initiating litigation. First, confirm subject matter jurisdiction. Second, establish personal jurisdiction over all necessary parties. Third, determine proper venue. This systematic approach, grounded in Alabama's rules of civil procedure and established common law precedent, ensures that legal actions are commenced in appropriate and legally sound forums, protecting client interests and upholding professional standards. Question 3. System analysis indicates that an attorney in Alabama is representing a client involved in a dispute concerning a recently enacted state statute governing digital asset transactions. The statutory language is somewhat vague regarding the definition of custodial services within this new context. The attorney has found persuasive, but not binding, decisions from other states that interpret similar language in their own statutes. The attorney is considering how best to advise their client on the interpretation of this Alabama statute, which approach best aligns with Alabama's statutory interpretation principles. Option A. Adopt a narrow interpretation of the statute due to its novelty and the lack of extensive Alabama case law, assuming the legislature intended to limit its application. Option B. Begin by analyzing the plain meaning of the words used in the Alabama statute, and if ambiguity persists, research the legislative history and purpose of the enactment to discern the legislature's intent. Option C. Advocate for an interpretation that most favors the client's desired outcome, even if it requires a strained reading of the statutory language. Option D. Primarily rely on persuasive decisions from other states that have interpreted similar statutory language, assuming their interpretations will be adopted by Alabama courts. Correct answer is B. Begin by analyzing the plain meaning of the words used in the Alabama statute, and if ambiguity persists, research the legislative history and purpose of the enactment to discern the legislature's intent. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an attorney to interpret a statute with potentially ambiguous language in the context of a new and evolving area of law. The attorney must balance the client's immediate needs with the long-term implications of their interpretation, ensuring compliance with Alabama's statutory interpretation principles. The challenge lies in discerning the legislature's intent when the statutory language is not perfectly clear and when there is limited case law directly on point. Careful judgment is required to avoid misinterpreting the law, which could lead to adverse legal consequences for the client and potential professional discipline. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves employing the plain meaning rule as the primary interpretive tool, supplemented by legislative intent analysis. This approach begins by examining the ordinary and natural meaning of the words used in the statute. If the language is clear and unambiguous, the inquiry generally ends there, and the statute is applied as written. However, when ambiguity arises, as it does in this scenario, the attorney should then look to the legislative history and purpose behind the enactment of the statute. This involves considering committee reports, floor debates, and the overall objective the legislature sought to achieve. This method aligns with Alabama's established principles of statutory construction, which prioritize the most natural interpretation of the text while allowing for consideration of legislative intent to resolve any ambiguities. This ensures that the interpretation is grounded in the statutory text and reflects the legislature's will. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely rely on persuasive authority from other states without first exhaustively analyzing Alabama's specific statutory language and legislative intent. While out-of-state decisions can be informative, they are not binding and may not reflect Alabama's unique legal context or legislative policy. This approach risks misapplying foreign legal principles to an Alabama statute, failing to adhere to the primary duty of interpreting the law as enacted by the Alabama legislature. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize the client's desired outcome over a faithful interpretation of the statute. This involves twisting the statutory language or ignoring clear legislative intent to achieve a favorable result for the client. This is ethically unsound and violates the attorney's duty to uphold the law. Alabama law, like all jurisdictions, requires attorneys to interpret statutes objectively, not to manipulate them to fit a predetermined conclusion. A third incorrect approach is to assume that because a statute is new, it should be interpreted narrowly to avoid unintended consequences. While caution is warranted, this approach can lead to an overly restrictive interpretation that thwarts the legislature's intended purpose. The absence of extensive case law does not automatically mandate a narrow construction. Rather, it emphasizes the importance of diligently applying established interpretive principles to ascertain the legislature's intent. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach statutory interpretation by first adhering to the plain meaning rule. If ambiguity exists, they should then diligently research and analyze the legislative history and purpose of the statute within the specific jurisdiction, Alabama, in this case. This involves consulting official legislative documents and understanding the problem the statute was designed to address. If the statute remains ambiguous after these steps, consideration of persuasive out-of-state authority can be a secondary tool, but it should never supplant the primary analysis of the governing jurisdiction's legislative enactments and interpretive traditions. Ethical considerations and professional responsibility demand an objective and faithful application of the law, prioritizing legislative intent over client preference or personal assumptions. Question 4. Risk assessment procedures indicate a financial advisor in Alabama has discovered a client is attempting to liquidate significant assets and abscond with funds, potentially defrauding the firm. The advisor, in an attempt to prevent further financial loss, blocks the client's exit from the advisor's office and prevents them from accessing their personal vehicle parked outside. The advisor also verbally warns the client that they will be arrested if they attempt to leave. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor to take in this situation to mitigate legal risk for themselves and the firm? Option A. Verbally threaten the client with arrest and financial ruin if they attempt to leave, while blocking their exit. Option B. Immediately contact legal counsel and law enforcement to manage the situation and secure assets. Option C. Physically prevent the client from leaving the office and accessing their vehicle. Option D. Physically escort the client out of the office and into a company vehicle. Correct answer is B. Immediately contact legal counsel and law enforcement to manage the situation and secure assets. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires distinguishing between a legitimate exercise of authority and an intentional tort. The financial advisor must balance the need to secure company assets with the legal and ethical boundaries of restricting a client's movement. Misjudging this balance could lead to significant legal liability for the firm and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to ensure actions are both effective in protecting the firm's interests and compliant with Alabama law regarding intentional torts. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves immediately contacting legal counsel and law enforcement to handle the situation. This approach is correct because it delegates the responsibility of detainment and asset seizure to entities specifically empowered and trained to do so within the bounds of Alabama law. Alabama law, like common law systems generally, requires a lawful basis for restricting an individual's liberty. By involving legal counsel, the firm ensures that any actions taken are legally sound and that the client's rights are respected. Engaging law enforcement provides the necessary authority to secure assets and detain the individual if warranted by probable cause, thereby mitigating the risk of claims for assault, battery, or false imprisonment. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and professional conduct. Incorrect approach is analysis, restricting the client's access to their personal vehicle and physically preventing them from leaving the office, even with the intent to prevent further financial harm, constitutes a significant risk of false imprisonment under Alabama law. False imprisonment occurs when a person is unlawfully restrained against their will. While the advisor may believe they are acting in the company's best interest, this action directly infringes upon the client's freedom of movement without legal justification. Another incorrect approach is to verbally threaten the client with legal action and financial ruin if they attempt to leave, while simultaneously blocking their exit. This combination of verbal threats and physical obstruction can be construed as assault, placing the client in apprehension of immediate harmful or offensive contact and false imprisonment. The threat of legal action, while potentially valid in other contexts, becomes part of an unlawful restraint when coupled with physical impediment. Finally, attempting to physically escort the client out of the office and into a waiting company vehicle, even if done with minimal force, could be considered battery if the client does not consent to the contact. Battery involves the intentional harmful or offensive touching of another person without consent. Even if the intent is to prevent the client from absconding with assets, the physical act of moving them against their will, without legal authority, crosses the line into a tortious act. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and de-escalation. First, assess the immediate threat to company assets and the client's potential for further harm. Second, recognize the legal boundaries of personal liberty and the potential for tortious conduct. Third, immediately consult with legal counsel to understand the firm's rights and obligations. Fourth, Involve appropriate authorities, such as law enforcement, to manage the situation lawfully. Fifth, document all interactions and decisions meticulously. This framework ensures that actions taken are both protective of the firm's interests and ethically and legally sound, avoiding the pitfalls of intentional torts. Question 5. What factors determine the historical development of common law in Alabama, considering its foundational principles and subsequent state-specific evolution? Option A. The most recent legislative amendments enacted by the Alabama legislature, irrespective of their historical context. Option B. The adoption of English common law upon statehood and its subsequent modification through Alabama's legislative enactments and judicial decisions. Option C. The influence of legal theories proposed by prominent legal scholars from jurisdictions outside of Alabama. Option D. The direct application of English common law precedents without regard to Alabama's own judicial interpretations. The correct answer is B. The adoption of English common law upon statehood and its subsequent modification through Alabama's legislative enactments and judicial decisions. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an understanding of how historical legal principles continue to influence contemporary legal interpretation in Alabama. The challenge lies in discerning which historical developments are most pertinent to understanding the evolution of common law in the state, particularly when faced with differing interpretations or the potential for new legislation. Careful judgment is required to avoid misapplying outdated doctrines or overlooking foundational precedents. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves examining the foundational English common law principles that were adopted by Alabama upon its admission to the Union, and tracing their subsequent adaptation and modification through Alabama's own legislative enactments and judicial decisions. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the historical development of common law in Alabama by acknowledging its roots and then analyzing its organic growth within the state's specific legal context. This aligns with the principle of stare decisis and the understanding that Alabama's common law is a living body of law, shaped by both inherited traditions and state-specific jurisprudence. Incorrect approaches analysis. Focusing solely on the most recent legislative changes without considering their historical underpinnings would be an incorrect approach. While recent legislation is important, it often builds upon or modifies existing common law principles. Ignoring the historical context can lead to an incomplete or inaccurate understanding of the current legal landscape. Another incorrect approach would be to exclusively rely on English common law precedents, without acknowledging how Alabama courts have interpreted, modified, or even rejected certain English doctrines over time. Alabama's legal system has evolved independently, and its own judicial decisions are paramount in defining its common law. Finally, prioritizing the legal theories of influential legal scholars from other jurisdictions without grounding them in Alabama's specific historical development and case law would also be an incorrect approach. While scholarly analysis can be insightful, it must be applied within the framework of Alabama's own legal history and precedent. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama should approach questions of common law development by first identifying the core English common law principles that form the basis of the state's legal system. They must then meticulously research Alabama's statutory law and judicial decisions to understand how these principles have been interpreted, applied, and potentially altered over time. This involves consulting historical legal texts, legislative records, and significant Alabama Supreme Court and Court of Appeals decisions. A systematic, chronological analysis, coupled with an understanding of the underlying policy reasons for legal changes, provides the most robust and accurate understanding of the historical development of common law in Alabama. Question 6. System analysis indicates that a client based in Alabama is considering a joint venture with a company based in a jurisdiction that primarily follows a civil law tradition. When advising the client on the legal implications within Alabama, what fundamental understanding of Alabama's legal system is most crucial for providing accurate counsel? Option A. Alabama's legal system is a hybrid system where procedural rules are paramount and substantive law is secondary to the efficient processing of legal matters, regardless of the underlying legal tradition. Option B. Alabama's legal system is primarily based on comprehensive, codified statutes that are interpreted in isolation, similar to civil law systems, and advice should focus on these statutes. Option C. Alabama's legal system is rooted in common law, where judicial precedent plays a significant role in interpreting statutes and establishing legal principles, and this must be explained to the client in the context of their potential transaction. Option D. Alabama's legal system is a pure civil law system, and the client's understanding should be shaped by the principles of codified law and legislative supremacy. The correct answer is C. Alabama's legal system is rooted in common law, where judicial precedent plays a significant role in interpreting statutes and establishing legal principles, and this must be explained to the client in the context of their potential transaction. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a legal professional in Alabama to navigate the fundamental differences between common law and civil law systems when advising a client on a cross-border transaction. Misunderstanding these foundational differences can lead to incorrect legal advice, potentially resulting in significant financial loss, contractual disputes, and reputational damage for the client. The professional must exercise careful judgment to identify the applicable legal system and its implications. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves accurately identifying that Alabama operates under a common law system. This means that legal principles are derived from judicial precedent, case law, as well as statutes. When advising on a transaction that might involve parties or assets in a civil law jurisdiction, the professional must clearly explain to the client that the legal framework in Alabama relies heavily on past court decisions to interpret statutes and establish legal rights and obligations. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the client's need for accurate information about the legal environment governing their potential transaction within Alabama, and highlights the critical distinctions if the transaction extends beyond Alabama's borders into a civil law jurisdiction. This aligns with the ethical duty of competence and diligence owed to the client. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that all legal systems operate on the same principles of codified law, similar to a civil law system, and to advise the client solely based on statutory interpretation without considering the role of judicial precedent in Alabama. This fails to acknowledge the foundational role of case law in Alabama's common law system, potentially leading to incomplete or inaccurate advice regarding the interpretation and application of statutes. Another incorrect approach is to focus exclusively on the procedural aspects of the transaction without adequately explaining the underlying substantive legal system. This might involve detailing filing requirements or court procedures, but neglecting to inform the client about how rights and obligations are established and enforced in Alabama's common law framework, which differs significantly from a civil law approach. A further incorrect approach is to conflate the two systems by suggesting that Alabama's legal system is a hybrid that equally prioritizes codified statutes and judicial precedent in the same manner as a civil law system might prioritize its codes. While statutes are important in Alabama, the doctrine of stare decisis precedent is a cornerstone of its common law system, making this approach misleading and inaccurate. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a clear identification of the governing legal system. For any matter within Alabama, the understanding must be rooted in common law principles. When cross-border elements are involved, the professional must then research and understand the legal system of the other jurisdiction. The advice provided should clearly articulate the differences and potential conflicts between the two systems, enabling the client to make informed decisions. This involves a commitment to continuous learning and a thorough analysis of the specific legal context of each transaction. Question 7. System analysis indicates a homeowner in Alabama enters into a written contract with a contractor for specific home renovation services at an agreed-upon price. Midway through the project, the contractor informs the homeowner that unforeseen difficulties have arisen, and they will require an additional payment to complete the work as originally specified. The homeowner, wanting the project finished, verbally agrees to pay the additional sum. Upon completion of the work, the contractor demands the additional payment. Based on Alabama common law principles, what is the most legally sound assessment of the homeowner's obligation to pay the additional sum? Option A. The homeowner is legally obligated to pay the additional sum because the contractor experienced unforeseen difficulties, and equity dictates that the homeowner should bear some of the additional cost. Option B. Homeowner is likely not legally obligated to pay the additional sum because the contractor's promise to complete the work was merely a performance of a pre-existing contractual duty, which does not constitute valid consideration for the homeowner's new promise. Option C. The homeowner is legally obligated to pay the additional sum because they verbally agreed to do so, and verbal agreements are always binding in Alabama for such matters. Option D. The homeowner is legally obligated to pay the additional sum because the contractor's completion of the work, regardless of prior obligations, provides sufficient benefit to the homeowner to create a binding agreement for the extra payment. The correct answer is B. The homeowner is likely not legally obligated to pay the additional sum because the contractor's promise to complete the work was merely a performance of a pre-existing contractual duty, which does not constitute valid consideration for the homeowner's new promise. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an understanding of the nuances of Alabama common law regarding the doctrine of consideration in contract formation. Misinterpreting the requirements for valid consideration can lead to unenforceable agreements, potential litigation, and damage to professional reputation. The professional must exercise careful judgment to distinguish between a legally binding promise and a gratuitous one. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves recognizing that a promise to perform an act that one is already legally obligated to perform generally does not constitute valid consideration under Alabama common law. This is often referred to as the pre-existing duty rule. For a promise to be binding, there must be a bargained for exchange of something of legal value, meaning the promiser receives a benefit or the promisee suffers a detriment that they were not already bound to undertake. In this case, the contractor's promise to complete the work they were already contractually obligated to do does not provide new legal value to the homeowner. Therefore, the homeowner's promise to pay an additional sum is likely unenforceable due to a lack of consideration. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that any promise, regardless of pre-existing obligations, constitutes valid consideration. This fails to acknowledge the established common law principle that a pre-existing duty does not serve as new consideration. This approach would lead to the conclusion that the homeowner is legally obligated to pay the additional sum, which is contrary to Alabama common law. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on the homeowner's intent to pay more, without analyzing the legal sufficiency of the contractor's promise. While the homeowner may have intended to offer more, the law requires more than just intent. It requires a valid bargain for exchange. This approach overlooks the fundamental requirement of consideration in contract law. A further incorrect approach is to consider the contractor's completion of the work as sufficient consideration for the additional payment, even if it was already required by the original contract. This misapplies the concept of consideration by treating the fulfillment of an existing obligation as if it were a new detriment or benefit. Alabama common law, like most jurisdictions, requires that the consideration be something beyond what was already owed. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing similar situations should first identify the core legal issue, which in this case is the doctrine of consideration in contract law as applied in Alabama. They should then recall or research the specific common law principles governing consideration, particularly the pre-existing duty rule. The decision-making process should involve analyzing whether the promise made by each party represents a bargain for exchange of legal value, considering any pre-existing contractual obligations. If a pre-existing duty is involved, it should be recognized as insufficient consideration for a new promise. Consulting relevant Alabama case law and statutes would further solidify the understanding of the applicable legal standards. Question 8. Strategic planning requires a financial advisor in Alabama to consider potential legal ramifications of their advice. If a client alleges that the advisor's recommendations led to significant financial losses due to negligence, what is the most appropriate framework for the advisor to use in assessing their potential liability under Alabama common law principles of tort law? Option A. Focus solely on whether the investment itself was a legitimate financial product, without considering its appropriateness for the individual client's circumstances. Option B. Conclude that any investment losses are solely attributable to market volatility, and therefore the advisor bears no responsibility, regardless of the specific advice given. Option C. Evaluate whether the advice provided was suitable for the client's stated investment objectives, risk tolerance, and financial situation, and whether the advisor acted with the diligence and skill expected of a prudent financial professional in Alabama. Option D. Rely exclusively on the general disclaimers signed by the client, assuming they absolve the advisor of all liability for investment performance. Correct answer is C. Evaluate whether the advice provided was suitable for the client's stated investment objectives, risk tolerance, and financial situation, and whether the advisor acted with the diligence and skill expected of a prudent financial professional in Alabama. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a financial advisor in Alabama to navigate the complexities of tort law, specifically negligence, in the context of providing investment advice. The advisor must determine their duty of care to the client, whether that duty was breached, and if the breach caused the client's financial losses. Misinterpreting these principles could lead to significant legal liability for the advisor and their firm. The best professional approach involves a thorough assessment of the advisor's actions against the established standards of care for financial professionals in Alabama. This includes reviewing the client's investment objectives, risk tolerance, and financial situation, and ensuring that the advice provided was suitable and aligned with these factors. If the advisor acted with reasonable care, diligence, and skill, consistent with what a prudent financial advisor would do under similar circumstances in Alabama, they have likely met their duty of care. This aligns with Alabama common law principles of negligence, which require proving duty, breach, causation, and damages. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's concern solely based on the fact that the investment was not guaranteed to be profitable. While investments inherently carry risk, a financial advisor has a duty to provide suitable advice. Failing to adequately assess the client's profile or recommending investments that are demonstrably unsuitable for their stated objectives and risk tolerance constitutes a breach of that duty. This overlooks the core principle of fiduciary responsibility, or the duty of care owed to a client, which is central to tort law in Alabama. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that because the market experienced a downturn, the advisor is automatically absolved of responsibility. While market fluctuations are a factor, the advisor's duty extends to recommending investments that are appropriate given the client's circumstances, even in a volatile market. Blaming external market forces without considering the suitability of the specific recommendations made to the client ignores the causation element of a negligence claim. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to rely on a general disclaimer in the client agreement as a blanket defense against any potential claims of negligence. While disclaimers can limit liability, they are not absolute and cannot shield an advisor from liability arising from gross negligence or a failure to meet their fundamental duties of care and suitability under Alabama law. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the client's needs, adhering to professional standards, documenting all advice and client interactions meticulously, and seeking legal counsel when complex liability issues arise. This framework ensures that advice is not only compliant with regulations, but also ethically sound and defensible. Question 9. The evaluation methodology shows that in a criminal trial in Alabama, after the presentation of evidence, the judge is preparing to instruct the jury. Considering the distinct roles of judges and juries in Alabama's common law system, which of the following actions best upholds the integrity of the judicial process? Option A. The judge meets privately with the jury foreperson to discuss the jury's initial thoughts on the evidence and to offer suggestions on how to reach a verdict. Option B. The judge provides the jury with comprehensive instructions on the applicable Alabama statutes and relevant case law, explaining the burden of proof and the standard of proof, and then allows the jury to deliberate without further comment unless the jury requests clarification on legal matters. Option C. The judge instructs the jury that they are not permitted to ask any questions about the law during their deliberations, as they are expected to understand it fully from the initial presentation. Option D. The judge, believing the evidence strongly points to guilt, informs the jury that in their deliberations, they should consider the defendant's likely guilt based on the presented testimony. The correct answer is B. The judge provides the jury with comprehensive instructions on the applicable Alabama statutes and relevant case law, explaining the burden of proof and the standard of proof, and then allows the jury to deliberate without further comment unless the jury requests clarification on legal matters. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that this scenario is professionally challenging due to the inherent tension between the judge's duty to ensure a fair trial and the jury's role as the finder of fact. The judge must maintain impartiality while guiding the jury on legal principles, and the jury must deliberate without undue influence. Careful judgment is required to balance these roles effectively. The best approach involves the judge providing clear, concise, and legally accurate instructions to the jury regarding the relevant Alabama law and the elements of the offense. This includes explaining the burden of proof and the standard of proof required for a conviction. The judge should then allow the jury to deliberate independently, intervening only to answer specific legal questions posed by the jury or to clarify instructions. This approach is correct because it upholds the fundamental principles of Alabama common law, which vest the jury with the exclusive power to determine facts and apply the law as instructed by the judge. This division of labor ensures a fair and impartial adjudication process, respecting the constitutional rights of the accused. An incorrect approach would be for the judge to express an opinion on the defendant's guilt or innocence during jury instructions. This is ethically and legally unacceptable, as it directly usurps the jury's fact-finding function and constitutes judicial bias, violating the defendant's right to a trial by an impartial jury as guaranteed by Alabama law. Another incorrect approach would be for the judge to refuse to answer any questions from the jury, even if those questions relate to the interpretation of the law. This failure to provide necessary clarification can lead to jury confusion and a verdict based on a misunderstanding of the law, undermining the integrity of the trial process and potentially leading to a miscarriage of justice. A further incorrect approach would be for the judge to engage in ex parte communications with the jury regarding the substance of their deliberations. Such communications are strictly prohibited in Alabama and violate the principles of open court and due process, as they deny the opposing party the opportunity to be present and heard. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to established legal procedures and ethical guidelines. This involves a thorough understanding of the respective roles of the judge and jury under Alabama common law, a commitment to impartiality, and a willingness to provide necessary legal guidance without encroaching on the jury's domain. When faced with ambiguity or potential juror confusion, the professional approach is to seek clarification through established legal channels and to ensure all communications with the jury are transparent and on the record. Question 10. The assessment process reveals that a client in Alabama has received a civil judgment against them for $500,000. The judgment accrues interest at the statutory rate of 7.5% per annum. To stay execution of this money judgment pending appeal, the client must file a notice of appeal and post a supersedious bond. The bond amount is typically the judgment amount plus 1 year's worth of accrued interest. If the client's attorney estimates the total cost of the bond to be approximately $37,500, and the client states they have $30,000 readily available, what is the most prudent course of action for the attorney to advise the client regarding the financial requirements for perfecting the appeal? Option A. Advise the client to file the notice of appeal immediately and attempt to negotiate the supersedious bond amount with the opposing counsel, as the exact figure is not critical at this initial stage. Option B. Calculate the precise supersedious bond amount, including the judgment and 1 full year of statutory interest, and advise the client on whether their available funds are sufficient to meet this exact requirement, exploring legal avenues for bond modification if necessary. Option C. Inform the client that their available funds are likely insufficient and suggest they abandon the appeal, as a full supersedious bond is mandatory and cannot be waived. Option D. Proceed with filing the notice of appeal and assume the court will allow the client to pay the bond in installments if the full amount cannot be immediately secured. The correct answer is B. Calculate the precise supersedious bond amount, including the judgment and 1 full year of statutory interest, and advise the client on whether their available funds are sufficient to meet this exact requirement, exploring legal avenues for bond modification if necessary. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the interplay of strict procedural timelines in Alabama's appellate courts and the potential for financial miscalculation impacting a party's ability to pursue their appeal. Careful judgment is required to ensure adherence to legal deadlines while accurately assessing the financial implications of court fees. The best professional approach involves accurately calculating the total cost of filing the notice of appeal and the required supersedious bond based on the judgment amount and the statutory interest rate in Alabama. This calculation must then be compared against the client's stated financial capacity. If the client can afford the calculated amounts, the attorney should advise them to proceed with payment within the prescribed timelines. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the procedural requirements of filing an appeal in Alabama, which mandates timely payment of fees and posting of a bond to perfect the appeal. Alabama Rule of Appellate Procedure 3a requires the timely filing of a notice of appeal, and Rule 7 requires a supersedious bond to stay execution of a money judgment, with the amount typically set by statute or court order, often including the judgment amount plus accrued interest. Accurate calculation ensures compliance and protects the client's right to appeal. An incorrect approach involves advising the client to file the notice of appeal without first confirming the exact financial requirements for the supersedious bond, assuming a standard percentage or a negotiable amount. This is professionally unacceptable because it risks the appeal being dismissed for failure to post the required bond within the statutory period. Alabama law is specific regarding bond amounts, and an assumption could lead to a critical procedural defect. Another incorrect approach is to advise the client that the appeal can proceed without a supersedious bond if they express financial hardship, without exploring all available legal avenues for relief or modification. This is professionally unacceptable because it misrepresents the legal requirements for staying a money judgment pending appeal in Alabama. While hardship might be a factor in seeking a waiver or modification of the bond amount under specific Alabama rules of civil procedure or appellate procedure, simply forgoing the bond without proper legal procedure is not permissible and could lead to the enforcement of the original judgment. A further incorrect approach is to focus solely on the client's desire to appeal without adequately explaining the financial obligations and potential consequences of noncompliance. This is professionally unacceptable as it fails to provide the client with a complete understanding of the process and risks involved, potentially leading to a situation where the client believes they are appealing when, in fact, procedural requirements have not been met due to financial noncompliance. Professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough review of the relevant Alabama rules of appellate procedure and civil procedure concerning appeals and supersedious bonds. This includes identifying the exact statutory interest rate applicable to the judgment, calculating the precise amount of the supersedious bond, and clearly communicating these financial obligations and deadlines to the client. If financial hardship is a concern, the professional should then research and advise on any applicable procedures for seeking a waiver, reduction, or alternative security arrangement as permitted by Alabama law, ensuring all actions are taken within the strict timelines prescribed by the court. Question 11. The assessment process reveals that a client in Birmingham, Alabama, wishes to initiate a civil lawsuit seeking damages for breach of contract totaling $75,000. Considering the structure of Alabama's judicial system, what is the most appropriate initial step to ensure the case is filed in the correct venue? Option A. File the lawsuit in the small claims division of the district court, as it is the most accessible and quickest venue for any civil dispute. Option B. File the lawsuit in the Alabama Circuit Court, as it possesses general jurisdiction over civil matters and can adjudicate claims of this monetary value. Option C. File the lawsuit in the Alabama District Court, as it handles a broad range of civil disputes and is designed for efficiency in resolving such matters. Option D. File the lawsuit in the probate court, as it has jurisdiction over all matters pertaining to estates and property disputes. The correct answer is B. File the lawsuit in the Alabama Circuit Court, as it possesses general jurisdiction over civil matters and can adjudicate claims of this monetary value. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario where a legal professional must navigate the complexities of Alabama's judicial system to determine the appropriate venue for a civil dispute. This is professionally challenging because misidentifying the correct court can lead to significant delays, increased costs for the client, and potential dismissal of the case, undermining the professional's duty of competence and diligence. Careful judgment is required to accurately assess the nature of the claim and the jurisdictional limits of various Alabama courts. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding of Alabama's court structure, specifically differentiating between courts of general jurisdiction and limited jurisdiction. This approach requires analyzing the subject matter of the dispute and the amount in controversy to ascertain which court is empowered to hear the case. For instance, if the claim involves a significant monetary dispute exceeding the jurisdictional limit of a lower court, or if it concerns a matter exclusively reserved for a higher court, like probate matters or certain equity cases, then filing in the appropriate court from the outset is paramount. This aligns with Alabama Rule of Civil Procedure 1, which emphasizes the just, speedy, and inexpensive determination of every action, and the ethical obligation to represent clients effectively within the established legal framework. An incorrect approach would be to file the case in a court of limited jurisdiction when the claim clearly falls outside its statutory authority, such as attempting to resolve a complex contract dispute involving damages exceeding the small claims court limit. This demonstrates a failure to understand the jurisdictional boundaries of Alabama's courts, violating the duty of competence. Another incorrect approach is to file in a court of general jurisdiction without first considering if a specialized court, like a probate court for estate matters, has exclusive jurisdiction. This can lead to unnecessary procedural hurdles and potential dismissal for lack of subject matter jurisdiction, failing to act with due diligence. Finally, assuming that any civil matter can be filed in any civil court without regard to specific jurisdictional rules is a fundamental error that disregards the hierarchical and functional divisions within the Alabama judicial system, thereby failing to provide competent representation. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear identification of the legal issue and the factual basis of the dispute. This should be followed by a meticulous review of Alabama's rules of civil procedure and relevant statutes governing court jurisdiction, including the Alabama Code sections defining the powers of the district court, circuit court, and specialized courts. A comparative analysis of the claims, characteristics against the jurisdictional prerequisites of each potential court is essential before initiating any legal action. Question 12. Quality control measures reveal that in a recent civil litigation case in Alabama, an attorney for the defendant sought to introduce testimony from a witness that, while factually accurate, would require a lengthy and complicated explanation to connect it to the central claims of the lawsuit, potentially confusing the jury. The attorney also considered presenting additional witness accounts that largely reiterated points already established by other admitted evidence. Which approach to presenting this evidence would best align with Alabama's common law system and its rules of evidence? Option A. Introduce all testimony that is factually accurate, regardless of its cumulative nature or potential to confuse the jury, arguing that the opposing party can object if they deem it inadmissible. Option B. Present all potentially relevant testimony, including repetitive accounts and complex explanations, to ensure the jury has the most comprehensive, albeit potentially confusing, picture of events. Option C. Prioritize introducing testimony that might evoke a strong emotional response from the jury, even if it requires extensive explanation, believing that a passionate jury is more likely to render a favorable verdict. Option D. Carefully select and present only the testimony that has significant probative value and is essential to understanding the case, avoiding cumulative or overly complex explanations that could confuse the jury or unduly delay proceedings. The correct answer is D. Carefully select and present only the testimony that has significant probative value and is essential to understanding the case, avoiding cumulative or overly complex explanations that could confuse the jury or unduly delay proceedings. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a party's desire to present potentially relevant evidence and the court's obligation to ensure fairness and efficiency in proceedings. The challenge lies in discerning when evidence, though seemingly connected to the case, crosses the line into being unduly prejudicial, cumulative, or a waste of judicial resources, thereby potentially undermining the integrity of the trial process. Careful judgment is required to balance the right to present a defense with the need for a streamlined and equitable adjudication under Alabama's rules of evidence. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding and application of the Alabama Rules of Evidence, specifically Rule 403, which governs the exclusion of relevant evidence. This approach requires the attorney to meticulously assess whether the probative value of the proposed testimony is substantially outweighed by the danger of unfair prejudice, confusing the issues, misleading the jury, undue delay, or needlessly presenting cumulative evidence. By proactively identifying these potential issues and framing the evidence within the bounds of admissibility, the attorney demonstrates a commitment to ethical advocacy and adherence to procedural rules. This proactive stance ensures that the evidence presented is both relevant and appropriately balanced against potential negative impacts on the trial's fairness and efficiency. Incorrect approach is analysis. Presenting testimony that is merely cumulative of other evidence already admitted, without offering any new or unique insights, constitutes a failure to respect the court's time and resources. This approach violates the principle of judicial economy and can lead to undue delay, as contemplated by Alabama Rules of Evidence Rule 403. It demonstrates a lack of strategic foresight in evidence presentation, offering testimony that, while potentially true, is likely to inflame the jury's emotions or biases in a way that distracts from the core legal issues of the case, represents a significant ethical and procedural misstep. This directly contravenes the prohibition against unfairly prejudicial evidence under Alabama Rules of Evidence Rule 403, as it risks prejudicing the jury against the opposing party based on factors unrelated to the merits of the case. Introducing testimony that requires extensive and complex explanations to be understood by the jury, or that introduces tangential issues that could confuse the central matters of the dispute, demonstrates a disregard for the clarity and efficiency of the trial process. This approach risks misleading the jury and causing undue confusion, which are explicit grounds for exclusion under Alabama Rules of Evidence Rule 403. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach evidence presentation by first identifying the core legal issues of the case. Then, they must assess proposed evidence for its direct relevance and probative value in proving or disproving those issues. Crucially, they must then conduct a rigorous self-assessment under the framework of Alabama Rules of Evidence Rule 403, considering the potential for unfair prejudice, confusion of issues, misleading the jury, undue delay, or needless presentation of cumulative evidence. If the probative value is substantially outweighed by these dangers, the evidence should not be offered. This analytical process ensures that advocacy remains within ethical boundaries and procedural rules, promoting a fair and efficient resolution of disputes. Question 13. The performance metrics show a marked increase in trust-related litigation within Alabama. A client, a beneficiary of a trust established under Alabama common law, expresses significant dissatisfaction with the trustee's investment decisions, claiming the trust's value has stagnated while other investments have performed better. The client believes the trustee has mismanaged the trust assets. What is the most appropriate initial course of action for legal counsel representing the beneficiary? Option A. Immediately file a lawsuit against the trustee for gross negligence based solely on the client's assertion of dissatisfaction and the perceived lack of growth in trust assets. Option B. Conduct a detailed review of the trust instrument and relevant Alabama case law to assess whether the trustee's actions constitute a breach of fiduciary duty, considering the trustee's duty of care, loyalty, and prudence as defined by Alabama common law. Option C. Advise the client that any investment underperformance automatically constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty by the trustee under Alabama law, regardless of market conditions or the trust's specific investment objectives. Option D. Recommend that the client withdraw their funds from the trust, as any perceived mismanagement by the trustee indicates an irreparable breakdown in the trust relationship under Alabama's equitable principles. The correct answer is B. Conduct a detailed review of the trust instrument and relevant Alabama case law to assess whether the trustee's actions constitute a breach of fiduciary duty, considering the trustee's duty of care, loyalty, and prudence as defined by Alabama common law. Explanation. The performance metrics show a significant increase in the number of trust disputes filed in Alabama courts over the past fiscal year. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of Alabama's common law system, particularly concerning the equitable principles governing trusts, to effectively advise clients and navigate potential litigation. The rise in disputes necessitates careful judgment to distinguish between legitimate claims and those lacking legal merit, while also considering the fiduciary duties involved. The best approach involves a thorough examination of the trust instrument and relevant Alabama case law to determine if a breach of fiduciary duty has occurred. This requires analyzing the trustee's actions against the standards of care and loyalty established by Alabama common law. Specifically, one must assess whether the trustee acted prudently, in good faith, and solely in the best interests of the beneficiaries, without self-dealing or conflicts of interest. Alabama's equitable principles, rooted in English common law but adapted through state statutes and judicial precedent, provide the framework for this analysis. Adhering to these principles ensures that the trust is administered according to the settlor's intent and the beneficiary's rights are protected. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the beneficiary's subjective feelings of dissatisfaction without concrete evidence of a breach of duty. Alabama law requires more than mere unhappiness. It demands proof of a violation of established fiduciary obligations. Another incorrect approach is to assume that any deviation from the beneficiary's immediate desires constitutes a breach. Trustees have a duty to act in the long-term best interests of the beneficiaries, which may sometimes involve decisions that are not immediately popular. Furthermore, focusing only on the financial performance of the trust without considering the trustee's adherence to procedural requirements and duty of loyalty is also flawed. Alabama law emphasizes the process and the trustee's conduct, not just the outcome. Professional decision-making in such situations should involve a systematic review of the trust agreement, identification of all relevant parties and their interests, a detailed factual investigation into the trustee's conduct, and a comprehensive legal analysis grounded in Alabama's common law of trusts and equity. This includes researching pertinent Alabama statutes and appellate court decisions to understand how equitable principles have been applied in similar contexts. Question 14. The audit findings indicate a potential misapplication of appellate procedures within the Alabama common law system. A legal team, having received an adverse judgment in a complex civil litigation matter heard in an Alabama circuit court, is considering the next steps for appeal. Which of the following accurately reflects the typical hierarchical pathway for appealing such a decision within Alabama's court system? Option A. An appeal from an Alabama circuit court in a civil matter would typically be filed with a United States District Court. Option B. An appeal from an Alabama circuit court in a civil matter would typically be filed with the Alabama Court of Civil Appeals, with potential further review by the Alabama Supreme Court. Option C. An appeal from an Alabama circuit court in a civil matter would typically be filed with the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals. Option D. An appeal from an Alabama circuit court in a civil matter would typically be filed directly with the Alabama Supreme Court, bypassing intermediate appellate courts. The correct answer is B. An appeal from an Alabama circuit court in a civil matter would typically be filed with the Alabama Court of Civil Appeals, with potential further review by the Alabama Supreme Court. Explanation: the audit findings indicate a potential misunderstanding of the Alabama court system's hierarchical structure, which is crucial for determining proper appellate pathways and the scope of judicial review. This scenario is professionally challenging because misinterpreting the hierarchy can lead to significant procedural errors, wasted resources, and potential prejudice to clients or parties involved. A thorough understanding of Alabama's common law system is paramount for ensuring legal efficacy and adherence to procedural rules. The correct approach involves accurately identifying the trial court of original jurisdiction and understanding the subsequent appellate levels within Alabama. This means recognizing that appeals from general civil and criminal matters typically proceed from the circuit courts to the Alabama Court of Civil Appeals or the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals, depending on the nature of the case. Further appeals from these intermediate appellate courts, under specific circumstances, can then be directed to the Alabama Supreme Court. This aligns with the established hierarchy, designed to provide a structured and systematic review of judicial decisions. Adherence to this hierarchy is mandated by Alabama rules of appellate procedure and fundamental principles of common law due process, ensuring that cases are reviewed by the appropriate judicial bodies. An incorrect approach would be to bypass the intermediate appellate courts and attempt a direct appeal from a circuit court decision to the Alabama Supreme Court in a matter that is not specifically designated for direct review by the Supreme Court. This disregards the established tiered system of appellate review and violates procedural rules, potentially leading to the dismissal of the appeal. Another incorrect approach would be to file an appeal with the wrong intermediate appellate court, for instance, filing a criminal appeal with the Court of Civil Appeals. This demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding of the distinct jurisdictions of these courts and would result in procedural delays and potential dismissal. Finally, assuming that all court decisions are subject to review by the Alabama Supreme Court, without considering the specific jurisdictional limitations and requirements for discretionary review, would also be an error, as the Supreme Court does not automatically hear every case appealed from lower courts. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a clear identification of the court that rendered the initial decision. Subsequently, they must consult the relevant Alabama rules of appellate procedure and statutory provisions to determine the correct appellate court based on the subject matter and nature of the case. This involves understanding the original jurisdiction of trial courts and the appellate jurisdiction of each subsequent court in the hierarchy. When in doubt, seeking guidance from experienced colleagues or legal resources specializing in Alabama appellate practice is a prudent step to ensure procedural correctness. Question 15. Quality control measures reveal that an attorney in Alabama is advising a client on resolving a complex contract dispute. The client is eager for a swift and cost-effective resolution, but is unfamiliar with the intricacies of alternative dispute resolution. The attorney must explain the available options under Alabama common law, ensuring the client makes an informed choice. Which of the following approaches best reflects the attorney's professional obligations? Option A. Inform the client that their best option is to proceed directly to litigation in an Alabama state court, as this is the most traditional and legally secure method of dispute resolution. Option B. Advise the client that arbitration is the most efficient route and present them with an arbitration agreement to sign, emphasizing the finality of the decision without fully explaining the waiver of their right to a jury trial. Option C. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client, thoroughly explaining the voluntary, non-binding nature of mediation and the binding, potentially final nature of arbitration, outlining the procedural differences and implications for their rights, and collaboratively determining the most suitable path based on the client's objectives and risk tolerance. Option D. Recommend mediation as the primary option due to its reputation for speed and cost-effectiveness, without extensively detailing the potential for non-resolution or the client's right to pursue litigation if mediation fails. The correct answer is C. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client, thoroughly explaining the voluntary, non-binding nature of mediation and the binding, potentially final nature of arbitration, outlining the procedural differences and implications for their rights, and collaboratively determining the most suitable path based on the client's objectives and risk tolerance. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a client's desire for a swift resolution and the fiduciary duty of an attorney to ensure the client understands and consents to the chosen dispute resolution method, particularly when that method may have significant implications for their rights and the outcome of the case. Alabama law, like other common law jurisdictions, emphasizes informed consent and the attorney's duty of loyalty and competence. The attorney must not only advise on the available ADR mechanisms, but also ensure the client comprehends the strengths, weaknesses, and potential consequences of each, aligning the chosen path with the client's best interests and objectives. The best approach involves a comprehensive discussion with the client about the nuances of mediation and arbitration as alternative dispute resolution mechanisms available under Alabama common law. This includes clearly explaining the voluntary and non-binding nature of mediation, where a neutral third party facilitates negotiation, allowing the parties to retain control over the outcome. It also requires detailing the binding nature of arbitration, where a neutral arbitrator or panel makes a decision that is typically final and enforceable, akin to a court judgment, and outlining the procedural differences and potential waiver of certain legal rights. The attorney must then guide the client in selecting the mechanism that best aligns with their specific goals, risk tolerance, and desired level of control over the resolution, ensuring the client's decision is fully informed and voluntary. This aligns with the Alabama rules of professional conduct, particularly those concerning communication with clients and diligence. An approach that unilaterally decides to pursue mediation without a thorough discussion of its implications, or one that pushes for arbitration solely because it might be faster, fails to adequately inform the client of the potential consequences. Mediation, while often efficient, does not guarantee a resolution, and the client might find themselves back in litigation without having fully explored other options. pushing for arbitration without ensuring the client understands the waiver of their right to a jury trial and the limited grounds for appeal is a significant ethical failure. It prioritizes expediency over the client's right to make an informed decision about their legal recourse. Another incorrect approach would be to simply present the client with a pre-drafted arbitration agreement without explaining the fundamental differences between arbitration and mediation, or the implications of waiving their right to a judicial forum. This bypasses the attorney's duty to provide competent advice and ensure the client's understanding. The professional reasoning process should involve a structured dialogue with the client, beginning with understanding their objectives, then outlining all relevant ADR options, detailing the pros and cons of each in the context of Alabama law, and finally, facilitating the client's informed decision-making process. Question 16. Quality control measures reveal that a financial advisor in Alabama is reviewing a complex investment strategy for a client. The advisor has found several judicial decisions that discuss similar investment scenarios, but they originate from different states, and some are from lower courts in Alabama that are not binding on higher state courts. What is the most professionally sound approach for the advisor to analyze these cases to ensure their investment advice is legally compliant and ethically sound under Alabama common law? Option A. Focus on the most recent industry publications and general financial planning principles, as these are more current than potentially outdated case law. Option B. Apply the oldest Alabama case law found that addresses a similar investment type, assuming that foundational legal principles remain unchanged. Option C. Primarily rely on decisions from other states that have similar economic conditions, as these are likely to reflect contemporary investment challenges. Option D. Prioritize and meticulously analyze binding precedent from Alabama appellate courts that closely matches the client's factual circumstances, while treating other cases as secondary persuasive authority. Correct answer is D. Prioritize and meticulously analyze binding precedent from Alabama appellate courts that closely matches the client's factual circumstances, while treating other cases as secondary persuasive authority. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a financial advisor in Alabama to navigate the nuances of Alabama common law, specifically how prior judicial decisions influence the interpretation and application of current investment advice. The advisor must distinguish between persuasive and binding precedent and understand the implications of relying on outdated or factually dissimilar case law when providing advice that could have significant financial consequences for a client. The potential for client harm due to misapplied legal principles necessitates meticulous case law analysis. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comparative analysis that prioritizes binding precedent from Alabama appellate courts directly relevant to the specific factual matrix of the client's situation. This approach is correct because Alabama's common law system mandates that lower courts follow decisions of higher courts within the state. By identifying and analyzing cases from the Alabama Supreme Court or Court of Civil Appeals that address similar investment scenarios, the advisor ensures the advice is grounded in established legal principles that are directly applicable and legally binding. This minimizes risk and upholds the duty of care owed to the client under Alabama law, which implicitly requires advice to be legally sound and based on authoritative legal interpretations. Incorrect approach is analysis. Relying solely on persuasive precedent from other states, even those with similar legal traditions, is professionally unacceptable. While such cases can offer insights, they do not carry legal weight in Alabama courts and may not reflect the specific public policy or statutory interpretations unique to Alabama. This failure to prioritize binding Alabama precedent risks providing advice that is legally unsupported and could be challenged. Another unacceptable approach is to disregard case law entirely and base advice solely on industry best practices or general financial principles. While these are important considerations, Alabama common law dictates that judicial interpretations of legal duties and liabilities are paramount. Ignoring relevant case law means the advisor is not adequately assessing the legal landscape governing their advice, potentially exposing the client to unforeseen legal risks and failing to meet the standard of care expected of a prudent advisor in Alabama. Furthermore, applying case law that is factually dissimilar or from a significantly different era without careful consideration of how legal principles have evolved is also professionally deficient. Alabama common law is dynamic. Older cases may have been superseded by later decisions or legislative changes. A superficial application of outdated or irrelevant precedent can lead to incorrect legal conclusions and, consequently, inappropriate investment advice. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama should adopt a systematic approach to case law analysis. This begins with identifying the core legal issues presented by the client's situation. Next, they must conduct thorough research to locate relevant decisions from Alabama appellate courts. The analysis should then focus on distinguishing or applying the facts of these binding precedents to the client's circumstances. If no directly binding precedent exists, persuasive authority from other jurisdictions can be considered, but with a clear understanding of its limited weight. The ultimate goal is to ensure that the advice provided is not only financially sound, but also legally defensible within the framework of Alabama common law, thereby protecting both the client and the advisor. Question 17. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need to assess the practical application of precedent in Alabama's common law system. A junior associate in an Alabama law firm is representing a client in a contract dispute. The associate discovers a controlling Alabama Supreme Court decision from 1955 that directly addresses a similar factual scenario and dictates a specific outcome. However, the associate believes that societal norms and economic realities have significantly changed since 1955, and that applying the 1955 precedent would lead to an unfair result for their client. What is the most professionally responsible course of action for the associate to take? Option A. Argue that the 1955 precedent is outdated and should be disregarded entirely due to changes in societal norms and economic realities, without a detailed analysis of how the current case might be factually distinguished. Option B. Adhere strictly to the 1955 precedent and advise the client that the outcome is predetermined, even if it appears unfair, without exploring any potential legal avenues for challenging or distinguishing the precedent. Option C. Focus solely on the client's desired outcome and present novel legal theories to the court that are not grounded in existing Alabama case law or established principles of contract law, hoping for a favorable interpretation. Option D. Thoroughly research the controlling precedent. Analyze whether the current case can be factually distinguished from the 1955 decision, and if not, develop well-reasoned legal arguments for why the precedent should be reconsidered or distinguished based on current Alabama law and evolving circumstances. The correct answer is D. Thoroughly research the controlling precedent. Analyze whether the current case can be factually distinguished from the 1955 decision, and if not, develop well-reasoned legal arguments for why the precedent should be reconsidered or distinguished based on current Alabama law and evolving circumstances. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a legal professional in Alabama to navigate the delicate balance between established legal precedent and the potential for evolving societal norms or unique factual circumstances. The principle of stare decisis, while foundational to the Alabama common law system, is not an immutable decree. It allows for reasoned departure when circumstances warrant. A careful judgment is required to determine when adherence to precedent is appropriate, and when advocating for a deviation is legally sound and ethically justifiable. The best professional approach involves thoroughly researching existing Alabama case law on similar matters, identifying the controlling precedents, and then critically analyzing whether the current case presents factual distinctions or compelling legal arguments that justify distinguishing it from prior rulings or, in rare circumstances, advocating for the overturning of a precedent. This approach prioritizes the integrity of the legal system by respecting stare decisis while simultaneously fulfilling the duty to zealously represent the client's interests within the bounds of the law. It acknowledges that precedent provides stability and predictability, but also recognizes that the law must be capable of adapting to new realities and correcting past errors. This is consistent with the fundamental principles of Alabama common law, which values both consistency and justice. An incorrect approach would be to blindly follow a precedent that appears to be outdated or unjust, without exploring whether the current case can be factually distinguished or legally challenged. This fails to uphold the duty of competent representation and may perpetuate an inequitable outcome. Another incorrect approach would be to disregard established precedent entirely and argue for a completely novel legal interpretation without a strong basis in existing Alabama law or a compelling rationale for overturning prior decisions. This risks undermining the predictability and stability that stare decisis provides and could be seen as an attempt to circumvent established legal principles rather than work within them. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on the client's desired outcome without considering the weight of precedent or the potential for legal arguments to be persuasive within the existing Alabama legal framework would be professionally deficient. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the relevant facts. This is followed by an exhaustive review of controlling Alabama precedent. The next step involves a critical analysis of how the current facts align with or diverge from established precedent. If the facts are distinguishable, the professional should articulate those distinctions. If the precedent itself is questionable or the legal landscape has shifted, the professional should develop well-reasoned arguments for distinguishing the case or, in exceptional circumstances, for reconsidering the precedent, always grounding these arguments in Alabama law and legal scholarship. Question 18. Regulatory review indicates a financial advisor in Alabama is considering initiating legal action against a former client who has relocated to another state but allegedly engaged in fraudulent activity while residing in Alabama. The advisor's primary concern is ensuring the lawsuit is filed in a court with the authority to hear the case and in the most appropriate geographical location within Alabama. Which of the following approaches best addresses the jurisdictional and venue requirements under Alabama common law systems? Option A. Ascertaining whether the Alabama court has subject matter jurisdiction over the type of dispute and personal jurisdiction over the former client, considering the client's minimum contacts with Alabama, and then determining the proper venue according to Alabama rules of civil procedure. Option B. Relying on the client's previous statement that they could be sued in Alabama because they previously lived there, without independently verifying the legal basis for jurisdiction and venue. Option C. Filing the lawsuit in the Alabama county where the financial advisor's office is located, assuming this county is the most convenient and therefore the proper venue for any dispute involving the advisor. Option D. Proceeding with the lawsuit based solely on the fact that the alleged fraudulent activity occurred while the client was a resident of Alabama, without further investigation into the client's current contacts with the state. The correct answer is A. Ascertaining whether the Alabama court has subject matter jurisdiction over the type of dispute and personal jurisdiction over the former client, considering the client's minimum contacts with Alabama, and then determining the proper venue according to Alabama rules of civil procedure. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a nuanced understanding of Alabama's jurisdictional rules, specifically the distinction between subject matter jurisdiction and personal jurisdiction, and how venue considerations interact with these fundamental requirements. A financial advisor must ensure that any legal action taken against a client, or initiated by a client, is filed in a court that possesses the legal authority to hear the case, jurisdiction, and is the appropriate geographical location for the trial venue. Failure to do so can lead to dismissal, wasted resources, and potential professional repercussions. The best approach involves a thorough assessment of both subject matter and personal jurisdiction under Alabama law, followed by a venue analysis. This means first determining if the Alabama state court has the power to hear the type of dispute, subject matter jurisdiction, and if it has the power over the defendant, personal jurisdiction. This typically involves examining if the defendant has sufficient minimum contacts with Alabama, as established by Alabama's long-arm statute and due process principles. Once jurisdiction is established, the advisor must then consider the proper venue, which under Alabama rules of civil procedure often relates to the county where the defendant resides or where the cause of action arose. This comprehensive evaluation ensures the legal action is procedurally sound from its inception, respecting the established legal framework in Alabama. An incorrect approach would be to file suit solely based on the client's residence in Alabama, without verifying if the defendant has sufficient minimum contacts with the state to establish personal jurisdiction. Alabama courts require more than mere residency of one party to assert jurisdiction over an out-of-state defendant. This oversight ignores a critical constitutional and statutory requirement for valid legal proceedings. Another incorrect approach is to focus exclusively on venue, assuming that because the advisor's office is located in a particular Alabama county, that county is automatically the correct venue for any dispute, regardless of where the defendant resides or where the alleged wrongdoing occurred. While venue is important, it is secondary to establishing proper jurisdiction. Filing in the wrong venue, even with proper jurisdiction, can lead to inconvenience and potential dismissal, but failing to establish jurisdiction at all renders the entire proceeding void. A third incorrect approach is to rely on a client's assertion that a lawsuit can be filed anywhere they feel wronged, without independently verifying the legal basis for jurisdiction and venue. Professional responsibility demands that advisors do not blindly accept client pronouncements on legal matters, but rather apply their understanding of the law to ensure proper legal procedure. This approach risks initiating a lawsuit in a court that lacks the authority to hear the case, leading to wasted time and resources. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making process that prioritizes the fundamental requirements of jurisdiction before considering venue. This involves 1. Identifying the nature of the dispute to determine subject matter jurisdiction. 2. Analyzing the defendant's contacts with Alabama to establish personal jurisdiction, referencing Alabama's long-arm statute and relevant case law. 3. Consulting the Alabama Rules of Civil Procedure to determine the proper venue based on defendant's residence or the location of the cause of action. 4. Seeking legal counsel if there is any uncertainty regarding these complex legal principles. Question 19. Performance analysis shows that a junior associate in an Alabama law firm is researching a complex property dispute. The associate has found several cases that appear relevant to the issue. Which of the following approaches to utilizing these cases best aligns with the principles of Alabama common law and professional responsibility? Option A. Treat a decision from a federal district court in California as binding precedent if it addresses a similar factual scenario. Option B. Prioritize decisions from the Alabama Supreme Court and the Alabama Court of Civil Appeals that directly address the legal question, and also consider relevant decisions from the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. Option C. Focus primarily on recent decisions from Alabama circuit courts, as these courts are closest to the factual disputes. Option D. Give equal weight to decisions from the Alabama Supreme Court and decisions from the Supreme Court of Mississippi, as both states follow common law traditions. The correct answer is B. Prioritize decisions from the Alabama Supreme Court and the Alabama Court of Civil Appeals that directly address the legal question, and also consider relevant decisions from the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an understanding of the foundational principles of common law as they have evolved in Alabama, specifically concerning the establishment of legal precedent. The challenge lies in distinguishing between persuasive and binding authority, a critical skill for any legal professional practicing within the Alabama common law system. Careful judgment is required to ensure that legal arguments are grounded in established, controlling law, rather than merely influential but non-binding decisions. The best professional practice involves identifying and relying upon decisions from higher courts within the Alabama state court system or the relevant federal appellate courts when those decisions address the same legal issues. This approach is correct because, under Alabama's common law system, decisions from the Alabama Supreme Court and the Alabama Court of Civil Appeals and Court of Criminal Appeals for criminal matters are binding on all lower state courts. Similarly, decisions from the United States Court of Appeals for the relevant circuit, in this case, the 11th Circuit, are binding on federal district courts within that circuit and are highly persuasive, often treated as binding, by Alabama state courts when interpreting federal law or the U.S. Constitution. This adherence to hierarchical precedent is the cornerstone of stare decisis, ensuring consistency and predictability in the law. Relying solely on decisions from courts in other states, even those with similar legal traditions, is professionally unacceptable. While such decisions may offer persuasive insights and demonstrate how other jurisdictions have addressed similar issues, they do not establish binding precedent within Alabama. Alabama courts are not obligated to follow the rulings of courts in states like Georgia or Mississippi, even if those rulings appear well-reasoned. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to prioritize decisions from lower courts within Alabama over those of higher courts. For instance, a ruling from a probate court or a municipal court, while binding within its specific limited jurisdiction, cannot override a decision from the Alabama Supreme Court on the same legal question. This would violate the principle of stare decisis and undermine the hierarchical structure of the Alabama judiciary. Furthermore, treating decisions from federal district courts outside of the 11th Circuit as binding authority within Alabama is also incorrect. While federal district court decisions can be persuasive, they are not binding on Alabama state courts unless they interpret federal law and are from a circuit whose decisions are generally considered highly persuasive by Alabama courts. The primary binding federal authority for Alabama state courts on federal law issues would typically come from the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. The professional reasoning process for navigating such situations should involve a systematic approach. First, identify the controlling jurisdiction, Alabama state courts or federal courts addressing issues relevant to Alabama. Second, determine the hierarchy of courts within that jurisdiction. Third, search for decisions from the highest relevant court, e.g., Alabama Supreme Court, that directly address the legal issue at hand. Fourth, if no direct precedent exists from the highest court, consider decisions from intermediate appellate courts within the same jurisdiction. Fifth, only then, consider persuasive authority from other jurisdictions or lower courts, understanding its limited weight. Question 20. Operational review demonstrates that a retail store in Birmingham, Alabama, falsely imprisoned a customer for approximately 45 minutes due to a mistaken belief that the customer had shoplifted an item. The customer, a freelance graphic designer, was earning an average of $25 per hour at the time of the incident. The customer experienced significant emotional distress, humiliation, and anxiety as a result of the confinement. If the actual damages for emotional distress and humiliation are estimated at $2,500, and the conduct of the store's security personnel is deemed to be particularly reckless and indifferent to the customer's rights, what is the most appropriate calculation for total damages, considering Alabama common law principles for intentional torts? Option A. Calculate actual damages for lost wages by multiplying the hourly rate by the duration of confinement, and add the estimated emotional distress damages, with no consideration for punitive damages. Option B. Calculate actual damages for lost wages by multiplying the hourly rate by the duration of confinement, and add the estimated emotional distress damages, and then add punitive damages calculated as $1,000, regardless of the duration or severity of the conduct. Option C. Calculate actual damages for lost wages by multiplying the hourly rate by the duration of confinement, and add the estimated emotional distress damages, and then add punitive damages calculated as 10 times the estimated emotional distress damages only. Option D. Calculate actual damages for lost wages by multiplying the hourly rate by the duration of confinement, add the estimated emotional distress damages, and then add punitive damages calculated as 4 times the sum of actual wages and emotional distress damages. The correct answer is D. Calculate actual damages for lost wages by multiplying the hourly rate by the duration of confinement, add the estimated emotional distress damages, and then add punitive damages calculated as 4 times the sum of actual wages and emotional distress damages. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the need to accurately quantify damages for intentional torts, specifically false imprisonment, under Alabama common law. The calculation requires careful consideration of both actual losses and potential punitive damages, demanding a nuanced understanding of how Alabama courts assess such claims. The difficulty lies in translating the subjective experience of confinement into objective monetary terms, while also accounting for the deterrent and punitive aspects of damages. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a two-tiered calculation. First, determine the actual damages suffered by the plaintiff. This includes quantifiable economic losses such as lost wages during the period of confinement, and non-economic losses like emotional distress, humiliation, and loss of liberty. For lost wages, a simple calculation of hourly wage multiplied by the hours of confinement would be used. For emotional distress, while subjective, Alabama law allows for compensation based on the severity of the suffering. Second, consider the potential for punitive damages. Under Alabama common law, punitive damages are awarded to punish the defendant for egregious conduct and to deter similar future behavior. The calculation of punitive damages is discretionary and depends on factors such as the reprehensibility of the defendant's conduct, the duration of the wrongful act, the defendant's financial condition, and the need to deter similar conduct. A reasonable estimate for punitive damages would be a multiple of the actual damages, reflecting the severity of the intentional tort. For instance, if actual damages are calculated as $1,000 and the conduct was particularly malicious, punitive damages might be assessed at 3-5 times that amount. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely focus on quantifiable economic losses, ignoring the significant non-economic damages and the possibility of punitive damages. This fails to adequately compensate the plaintiff for the full scope of harm caused by the false imprisonment, which under Alabama law includes emotional distress and the loss of liberty. Furthermore, it disregards the deterrent purpose of punitive damages, which are a crucial component of intentional tort remedies in Alabama. Another incorrect approach would be to arbitrarily assign a punitive damage amount without any rational basis tied to the actual damages or the reprehensibility of the defendant's actions. Alabama courts require a reasonable relationship between compensatory and punitive damages, and a purely speculative punitive award would likely be overturned. This approach neglects the legal standards for assessing punitive damages, which are not meant to be a windfall but a measured response to wrongful conduct. A third incorrect approach would be to only consider the duration of the confinement in a linear fashion, without accounting for the severity of the impact on the plaintiff or the malicious intent of the defendant. While duration is a factor, Alabama common law recognizes that the emotional and psychological toll of false imprisonment can be substantial, even for short periods, and that the defendant's state of mind is critical in determining the appropriate level of damages. Professional reasoning. Professionals faced with quantifying damages for intentional torts in Alabama should adopt a systematic approach. Begin by meticulously documenting all provable economic losses. Concurrently, assess the non-economic damages, considering the plaintiff's testimony regarding emotional distress, humiliation, and the impact on their daily life. Finally, evaluate the defendant's conduct for elements of malice, oppression, or fraud to determine the appropriateness and potential magnitude of punitive damages, always keeping in mind the need for a reasonable relationship between compensatory and punitive awards as guided by Alabama case law.